Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the Lowdown on Housing Preferences and Building Starts in Ontario. My name is Franz Hartmann. I'm the coordinator with the Alliance for Livable Ontario. Please feel free to use the chat function to say hi and to let people know where you are in the province. We are recording this webinar and we'll make it available along with the presentation decks at the Alliance for Livable Ontario website, hopefully sometime next week. Also, please use the Q&A function at any time to post any questions you have. Again, please use the Q&A function for questions that you want to ask to panelists. Do not use the chat function because I'm going to be monitoring the Q&A function for the questions. This event is co-sponsored by the Alliance for Livable Ontario and the Municipal Leaders for Stronger Communities. The Municipal Leaders is a network of community leaders who want to provide a space for municipal leaders to access experts, knowledge, and resources to help build stronger communities. The Alliance for Livable Ontario is an alliance of people and groups representing hundreds of thousands of Ontarians from many different sectors. We're nonpartisan, and we want to build a livable Ontario and stop government policies that falsely claim they will solve the housing challenges facing us, while actually making them worse, harming our communities, and undermining the protection of our farmland, natural areas, and democratic institutions. First, let me begin with a land acknowledgement. We recognize that our work and the work of our members takes place on traditional Indigenous territories across the province. We acknowledge that there are 46 treaties and other agreements that cover the territory now called Ontario. We are thankful to be able to work and live in these territories, and we are thankful to the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people who have cared for these territories since time immemorial and who continue to contribute to the strength of Ontario and to all communities across the province. We are honored to collaborate with Indigenous colleagues, rights holders, and communities. Acknowledging traditional Indigenous territories is one way to recognize contemporary and historical Indigenous presence and land rights. It is a small step towards dismantling the continued impacts of colonialism and undoing Indigenous erasure in our everyday lives. Again, welcome to the Lowdown on Housing Preferences and Building Starts in Ontario. This evening, we're going to discuss what sort of housing Ontarians want. And I think I'm just going to hit the stop share for a moment right now. We've heard the Premier repeatedly say some version of every Ontarian wants a single family home with a white picket fence, probably in the suburbs. It's a message echoed by others, especially developers who focus on building single family homes in so-called greenfield developments. Others, including many of our member groups, argue people want to live in existing towns and cities in many different types of housing. But what do people want? What do consumers want? In a moment, we're going to hear brand new data from on people's housing preferences and what builders are actually building. And to guide us through this, let me introduce our experts. Sarah Roberton is Senior Vice President in Corporate and Public Affairs at Environics Research. Sarah uses research for good, helping clients to develop policies, programs, strategy, and communications that resonate with their audiences and make a real difference. Her strength is storytelling, based on data and evidence that shed light on the direction organizations need to take to be successful. She has honed her skills over more than 2 decades working for leading marketing and public opinion research companies in Ottawa, Montreal, and Toronto. Welcome, Sarah. Kevin Eby is a registered provincial planner who served as the Director of Community Planning with the Regional Municipality of Waterloo from 1999 to 2015 and has extensive experience dealing with growth plan implementation. He also sat on the province's Greenbelt Council from 2018 to 2020 and since then has been advising many, many different clients throughout the province. We're going to start with presentations, first by Sarah and then Kevin. Then I've got a couple of questions for Sarah and Kevin, and then you get a chance to ask your questions. So please use the Q&A function to ask your questions. As I said before, if you put them in the chat function, I won't see them. So let's start with Sarah. Sarah, over to you.
Thank you very much. Just getting this set up. Give me one moment. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for inviting me, Franz. It's a pleasure to be here to share some brand new data, as Franz mentioned, that we've pulled about housing preferences. The focus actually for us tonight is GTA, but we think that this has applicability to a number of different municipalities, and is something we are looking forward to kind of spreading around over time. But we had to start somewhere, so it was easiest to start with the GTA. So let me talk first about why we did housing preference research in particular. Then I'll take you through like what we actually did in terms of our methodology, the insights from the research, and what we think are some of the key takeaways. So I think you'd have to be living under a rock not to know that housing availability and affordability have been kind of top of mind in Canada for the past several months, and that's nowhere more so than in Ontario and the GTA, which is one of the most expensive housing markets in Canada. And a lot of the discussion is around what are the causes of the housing shortage, and what are the potential solutions, policy solutions put forward by governments at all different levels. There seems to be only really one certainty at this point. It's going to take a lot of time to build the amount of new housing that experts say that we need. What we feel is maybe missing from the discussions is housing preference. So the houses that are being built now are not going to be available, right, for another 5-10 years potentially. What kind of home and community do residents want to live in 5 or 10 years down the road? So this is really about calibrating the efforts that we put into building homes now to match what our population wants and needs. So that's why we focused on preference. Where do you want to live? And in terms of how we went about doing the research, we did an online survey of just over 1,000 GTA residents, adult residents, so 18 plus or older. So this is a good, robust sample size. It allows us to look kind of overall, but also to break down by region, by age, gender, income, generation, that type of thing. And the data is pulled to be representative of the population and then weighted to census data. So it kind of looks like what we expect the GTA population to look like. I will just mention off the top that this is GTA, it's not GTHA. So we did exclude Hamilton from this. And throughout the presentation, I'm going to refer to generational data. This is how we define generational groups at Environics. So we go by years of birth. So you can see the kind of definitions there: boomers, Gen X, millennials, and Gen Z. Unfortunately, the sample size for elders is too small to report separately, so we have not split those out. And then just to be clear, for the Gen Z group, for this survey, people had to be 18 years or older. So the Gen Z segment gets cut off, right? It's really 1996 to 2006, and not anybody that's under 18. Okay, so housing insights from the GTA. So first finding is that GTA residents are feeling constrained in their housing choices. We asked them, you know, how much choice do you feel there is in the housing available to you in your area at a price that you can afford? And a majority of them, more than half, 56%, feel there is little to no choice in housing in their area at an affordable price for them. This is a perception question, really. This speaks to how people are feeling about their chances of finding a suitable home at this point. It's not surprising that it's linked demographically to having a lower income. So if you see households with incomes under 60K, 2/3 of them feel they have little to no choice. It's also linked to renters and to living in a home other than a single detached family home. So if you're in another dwelling type other than a single family home, 62% say that they have little to no choice. But you look at that 150K income bracket, even half of those feel that they're constrained in terms of having little to no choice in what that is available to them in their current area right now. Sorry, I'll just go back. There isn't a lot of difference here between regions, and there isn't a lot of change or difference in terms of generations. So this is really about linked to kind of demographics, about how people see their availability of choice. So the next question is a key one. So I wanted to show you how we asked it. And what we said is, if you had to make a change to your housing in the next 5 to 10 years, which of the following would you prefer? So number one, you prefer to live in an attached single family home, even if it's in a neighborhood where you need a car to get to most destinations. Or number two, you'd prefer to live in a neighborhood where everything's within walking distance for you, but you're not in a detached single family home. Or number three, you genuinely have no preference for the above. And I would just want to mention that the choices 1 and 2 are randomized, right? So depending, throughout our entire sample of 1,000, roughly half would have seen number one first, roughly half would have seen number 2 first. So no order bias here in terms of how we presented the 2 options. So I think what we found most interesting is that this narrative that the Canadian dream as a single family detached home is not as widely as attractive as, as that narrative would expect us to believe, lead us to believe. So let's take a look at the data. If you had to make a choice to your housing in the next 5 to 10 years, which would you prefer? 46% say, I want something in walking distance, even if that means I can't have a single family home. 38% say, no, I prefer a single family home, even if that means I need a car. 16% generally have no preference. So by a slight margin, there's that preference for a walkable neighborhood over a single family detached home. Now, yes, if you live in a single family detached home already, which is the bottom bar, you want to stay in one. I don't think that's surprising. It's kind of like the opposite there. 48% say, yeah, I want to stick with where I am. And if you live in another type of home, 55% say, yeah, single family home isn't the be all and end all for me. It's possible that some of the thinking is constrained by what they already know. I mean, but I think it's still pretty evident that those who are not living in a single family detached home, it's not necessarily that that's what they're striving for, that that's the silver bullet for them. That's kind of the thing that they've always wanted that they just can't have. Even when we ask them to think out 5 to 10 years, they're not hanging their hat on a single family home, detached home. Because the preference for staying in a single family detached home obviously then leads to the regional differences that you would expect. So in the 416, less preference for a single family detached home, more preference in the 905 regions where there are more of those types of homes. But what's fascinating is it doesn't lead to the generational differences that you might expect. So if we look at this by generation, we see that boomers are actually the most interested in walkability. So we think about boomers and the sheer number of them and the wealth that they have invested overall and in their homes. And yet they're almost twice as likely to say, actually, if I had to move in 5 to 10 years, I would give up a single family detached home to be in a walkable neighborhood. Same thing with Gen Z. They have this kind of preference for a walkability. It's the Gen Xers and the millennials that are really kind of divided, split down the middle, depending on, I guess, where they're at as to what their preference is. And then when we can break this down further to kind of see that this general effect has implication for movement across the housing market as boomers age. So give me a second to kind of set up this, because I know it's a bit of a complicated graph. But essentially what I've done here is taken the generations, but limited them in this graph on the left-hand side to those who already live in a single family detached home. So these are people that are already living in the type of home we're asking about, and broken that down by boomers, Gen X, millennials, and Gen Z along the bottom. And then we ask them, which one do they prefer? The blue square are those who say, yeah, I still prefer a single family detached home, even if that means I have to drive. The orange triangle are those who say I prefer to walk now. And even though I'm in a single family detached home now, in 5 to 10 years, I can see myself not in that space. So if the choice was available to them, which is kind of a big if at this point, boomers in single-family detached homes are almost as likely to prefer a walkable community with no single-family detached home at 37% than they are to stay, I want to stay kind of where I am, or in the kind of home that I'm already in. And what this means is that if we can improve the availability of options to single-family detached homes for boomers, they can then kind of move over to those types of homes and pass along the availability of single-family detached homes for younger generations. And I think, like, when I looked at the data, I was like, okay, well, maybe all those not living in a single-family detached home, then the opposite side of this graph, want to move into one, right? Maybe that's the dream. Maybe but that's so maybe we still need a lot of them, but that's not actually the case. It's not that the single-family detached home is that what they're in currently is a second choice situation for them, and they're just waiting for a single-family detached home. So this is the opposite side of the equation. These people are currently living in an other dwelling type, and if you see, it's reversed. Most of them in all generations prefer to stay in a walkable neighborhood, and they're not like they're not antsy, I guess is what I'm trying to say, to get into that single family home. So that's just really interesting to me. If we think about kind of, as I said, movement across the generations and how the types of homes might be transferred kind of back and forth in a meaningful way. And then finally, we asked, okay, so if you favor a walkable neighborhood, if that's your choice, that 46%, well, what kind of housing do you want? And what's interesting here is there's no one size fits all housing type. So among those who prefer a walkable neighborhood, it really ranges. So these were the options that we gave them. And this was their first choice preference out of all those options. 3 in 10 say, okay, I'd prefer a semi-detached or a townhouse. But then there's a big split there among the remainder of what they're interested in. A family-style multi-unit house, a self-contained unit on a single-family detached lot, a high-rise, a mid-rise, a low-rise. So again, that sense of not one size fits all. Along the bottom in the bold are some of the kind of leanings or preferences or skews, depending on where people live. So a bit more of a preference for a semi-detached if you live in the 905, or if you have if you're in the highest income bracket. Family style in a multi-unit house, a little bit more of a preference for the millennials and the Gen Z, so the younger generations. High rise is a little higher among renters, so a little bit of that staying where I feel comfortable, where I know. And boomers showing a little bit more interest, relatively speaking, in mid rises and low rises compared to the average. And again, this is among that subgroup of 46% who said they'd prefer a walkable neighborhood. So a range of kind of types of housing that people feel interested in. So I think before I get into the key takeaways, I just want to acknowledge the challenges in measuring housing preference. So asking people to think ahead to an admittedly uncertain future, like no one can predict 5 to 10 years in the future with perfect accuracy. And it's hard for people to think ahead to, oh, you're asking me to I have to make a change. But that also means we shouldn't necessarily rely on how things have been done in the past. So because that ignores changing societal and personal preferences and needs, which I think we saw here. So in terms of key takeaways, there is interest in alternatives to single family dwellings that need a car to get around. Not all non-single family dwelling residents are just sitting around dreaming about a single family detached home. So we just need to check our kind of assumptions about what people are looking for and really look to the data. What's the data telling us? The data tells us that the GTA is really on the far end of the spectrum for diversity. And what that calls for then is diversity of housing choice. If you think about how people will be best served in the future, it's kind of reflecting the diversity that exists in the population in our housing. And so this data makes a strong case for building with a keen understanding of what housing people need and want. And a big part of that diversity is generational. Their experts have been talking about, boomers moving into smaller homes, opening up single family detached homes for Gen X's and millennials. that seems to be borne out, as part of the solution here. And then also continuing to monitor the Gen Z preferences, because their values and preferences suggest that maybe single family detached home is not their end goal. Yes, that may change a little bit as they move into child rearing years, but I think at Environics we spend a lot of time looking at values and generational change, and the one thing we know is that there is always change, and so we need to keep that in mind as we're looking ahead. And so I just wanted to end here. This QR code, if you scan it, will take you to the website where you can go to download the results if you're interested in having a copy of the report for yourselves. I'll just leave that for 1 second.
Yeah, just keep that up for a moment. Just an observation, an editorial observation on my part. What I find fascinating about these numbers is that I've obviously been paying attention to what's been said at Queen's Park for the last 4 or 5 years. And my interpretation has been, there's been this constant refrain from the Premier that everybody wants a single family house, that everybody wants to live in a sort of suburban setting, which of course was the justification for opening up the Greenbelt lands back in 2022. And this data suggests even after that intensive 4 years, there's a significant portion of people who just don't buy that for a whole bunch of different reasons. Anyway, thank you so much for that. I'm going to suggest now that you stop sharing screen and hand it over to Kevin Eby. Kevin.
Thank you, Franz. Thank you very much. I'm pleased to be here today. It's interesting to see the data that Sarah has come up with. And in fact, what's interesting is when we take a look at the actual construction that's been occurring over the last while, it matches the data relatively well. So let me just start. The fixation on building single detached homes is misguided. It seems to have become a fixation for the developers and for the provincial government. And just to give you some sense, growth plan for the Greater Golden Horseshoe came about in 2006, provided population, household, and employment forecasts for the 21 upper tier municipalities or single cities. Municipalities are required to use these for planning, mainly used to justify urban expansions and DC bylaws. And the forecasts in the growth plan were terrible at predicting distribution of growth, and especially housing by type. And to give you a sense, this is looking at the growth plan forecast for the GTA8 for the time period 2006 to 2021. They forecast 63% single detached units in that time frame over that 15 years. What was actually built was 36% single detached units. And in fact, apartments that were constructed exceeded the forecast by 77%. So we had a huge shift that occurred from what was anticipated as singles into the apartment style. And it didn't just happen in the provincial forecasts. Hemson for Halton in 2009 did a market demand projection for 2006 to 2031 and projected almost 60% singles, 13% apartments. And the report is classic because it says, 31% apartments would likely be extremely difficult for them to meet starting in 2016, which is when the original intensification targets were due. And in fact, Halton made 37% apartments over the 10 years from 2011 to 2021. And if you're looking at trends, it's 45% in the last 5 years. Singles declined significantly in that time period. Altus, a different land economist, in the regional Waterloo land budget OMB hearing, projected 64% from 2006 to 2031, and 17% apartments To date, we've built in Waterloo 31% singles, not 64, and apartments at 51%. And to year end 2023, 70% of the planning period, we built 207% of the apartments that were forecast to 2031 and only 34% of the singles. And for those people who like graphs show better, this is the city of Waterloo, DC forecast. And the actuals are in blue and the forecast is in orange. And at no point in the previous almost 14 years had the city of Waterloo come even close to building the number of singles and semis that the DC forecast for the next 20 odd years. And it continues. And this is, I think, one of the more shocking reports that I've looked at. And I wish people would read some of these reports in detail, because I've never talked to anybody who's gone in and really looked at the 2020 growth plan forecast background report. But in it, if you look at the percent of singles and semis that are forecast from 2021 to 2051, there's only 4 municipalities out of the 21 that they forecast under 50% single detached units. And the numbers are insane. They are incredibly out of line with what we're actually seeing for the majority of these particular areas. And this is critical, because how this forecast was used was it was used to distribute population. And so what they had to do was they looked at how many singles they were forecasting, and then went and looked for places to put singles. And so if you're forecasting this high percentage of singles, you're going to be seeing significant populations pushed outward into the greenfield areas, and that's exactly what's happened. Just quickly looking at Halton and Waterloo, which I spoke to earlier, Halton, the growth plan forecast projects 50.1%, but Halton was at 33% in the last 5-year period. Waterloo, the growth plan forecast says 43%. Waterloo, the region of Waterloo hasn't been at 40% since at least 2009. So what is changing that's going to drive this huge increase in the percentage of singles? There's nothing that's going to do it. And in fact, the source of the problem is the projection methodology guideline that the province has really promoted since 1995, and it looks backwards and extrapolates forward. So it basically looks at housing preference in the past and says that's going to apply in the future. And basically it doesn't work when key assumptions are rapidly changing. Things like affordability, there's all kinds of factors, but it doesn't work if rapid changes are occurring. And if we know anything about the future housing market, it's that the future isn't going to be like the past. And when you look at the factors that influence housing purchasers, and like the data I've been showing you, this will be posted on the website, so you can go in and take a look at it. But there are really significant factors that people take into consideration in buying homes, and we are seeing huge changes in those various issues. So it's virtually impossible, well, it's almost irresponsible to say the choices made in the past are going to be like the choices made in the future, because they're not going to be. And to give you a sense of more recent construction, I picked 8 census subdivisions: Barrie, Guelph, Hamilton, London, Niagara, Oshawa, Ottawa, and Waterloo. And I picked them before I looked at any data at all for these, just so you know that. And the census subdivisions are good because they also pick up the smaller communities around them. So, like when you're looking at Guelph, you're not just looking at Guelph, you're looking at the surrounding smaller communities as well. And 6 of the 8 show a steady decline in the percentage of singles and semis from 2016 to 2023, and correspondingly an increase in apartments. 2 remained relatively flat, Barrie and Guelph. Guelph did because they're already have advanced to the point that they're very low on single detached units. And to give you a sense of some, here's Hamilton's numbers. If you look at the singles, clearly declining as as we go down, not quite as much on the decline there, but the apartments are certainly going up. When you look at Niagara, the singles are clearly declining. Apartments as a percentage are clearly going up. When you look at Ottawa, the exact same thing. We're seeing that these are really important trends because they straddle the whole COVID environment, and we're seeing up-to-date data here. And when you look at just the cumulative totals of all these communities, it again, we're seeing a consistent decline in the number of singles being built and a consistent increase in the number of apartments. And I just want to take a quick look at the region of Waterloo. There's some really interesting data here. Talk about a graph that shows it makes sense. The number of single detached units have just plummeted for 20 years. Last year, we were about 10% singles. And people automatically go to why? Was this because there's a shortage of approved lots? Well, since 2006, we've averaged 19,657 approved units, and that's draft approved and registered unbuilt. During the same time period, the home builders have only built 1,815 homes on average. That means they're building less than 10% of the approved units. At the units that were approved at year end, they're building less than 10% of them in the next calendar year. If you look at, whether there's a shortage of approved singles, we have approved singles coming out of our ears. We've averaged 8,751 approved. There's been no shortage at all in those. One of the really interesting ones was ground-related units. And in fact, since 2015, you see the numbers there, they are stunningly close because year after year, the subdivision approval process successfully replaces approved inventory that's absorbed by the home building industry in the previous year. Was there a shortage of shovel-ready lots? We're trying to find some reason here. And there wasn't. Last year, we had at the end of the year, there were 11,800 singles in the subdivision inventory. 2,142 of those were unbuilt registered or shovel-ready units. We only built 582. So we built less than 30% of the shovel-ready units in that calendar year. There's been more than 2,700 units available since 2006. And then my favorite is the facts on accessory dwelling units. In the last 3 years, there's 21 to 23, there's been more building permits were issued for accessory dwelling units than the growth plan forecast provided for to 2051. So the first 3 years, they met the 30-year forecast. 18% of all dwelling units built last year were accessory dwelling units in the region of Waterloo, and it was the second highest year of construction on record. So it's not 18% of a low number, it's 18% of a huge number. And my favorite is almost twice as many ADUs were built last year as singles were built in the designated greenfield area in the region of Waterloo. ADUs are not an afterthought anymore. They are a really key part of our housing market. So what's causing this? The market is changing, and it has been for some time. There's been no shortage of lots. There's been lots of opportunity. There's affordability issues, absolutely no question. But the market is looking for something different than is being delivered. So we need to refocus our efforts and deliver the kind of housing needed in our communities. And I think it's really important to recognize that, everybody seems to be in a mindset where anything, anywhere of any kind is good. And that's not true at this point. We really need to focus in and deliver the housing that's actually going to resolve our issues. We need to build housing, building what Sarah said, that's attractive to seniors, to draw them out. They occupy a massive number of underutilized singles at this point. The number of you go into counties or cities and look at the census data, and the number of these homes with 1 and 2 occupants is stunning. And there are huge numbers there. We've got to attract them out of them with attractive housing. We're not kicking them out. We want to help them to move into housing that's more conducive to their aging. One of the areas we need to focus on is building seniors housing in rural communities. It is abysmal out there. When you look at the, most of the counties, the townships have 88 to 92% singles, and they probably have 40% of their population is going to be retiring in the next 10, 15 years. And there is no housing that's conducive to seniors aging. So we're going to have massive movement of seniors out of the rural communities, and they won't want to do that. We've got to get on that right away. We need to assure affordable product gets onto the market, and particularly multiple bedroom rentals. We need the governments to get back into the provision of non-market housing, and I can't stress this enough. We are not going to solve our housing problems through the private sector. It just is not going to happen. And the sooner governments recognize that, the better off we're going to be. And we need to focus on building accessory dwelling units. The gentle density is a huge component of solving the problem. It provides so much additional flexibility in the housing market in the form of rentals, allows for multi-generational. It does all kinds of things. So with that, Franz, I'll turn it back to you. And I apologize if I went a little long.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Very, very interesting results. What especially strikes me, and I'll admit I'm somebody who lives in a single-family house, that there's such an incredible capacity of single-family homes out there already. And as you noted, if we just made it attractive for people my age and older to move into other places, boy, oh boy, it's almost like there may already be sufficient single-family homes out there. It's just a question of making sure that people live in the right places. So, and that gets to Sarah's point about choice, and what the data shows is that people don't feel there's the sufficient choice. Well, thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Sarah, for very, very interesting and important data that you presented. If you have questions for Sarah and Kevin, please throw them into the Q&A function, and we'll get to those in a moment. But before we do that, I have 2 questions for Sarah and Kevin. I suspect, well, I know that there are a number of municipal officials who have joined us on this call right now, and you've presented some very challenging and important, compelling data. So first to you, Sarah, what advice would you give to municipal leaders about how to respond to this data?
Thanks for the question, Franz. I think I would answer this by kind of putting on my public affairs hat, which is kind of where I'm coming from here. I would kind of acknowledge the attention that exists right now on the housing file, right? For municipalities, it brings with it a lot of pressure, and I suspect it's bringing with it a lot of money, and that kind of brings in a lot of people with vested interests in the topic. And in this environment, it can, be easy to lose sight of what the public wants and needs. I'm not talking about policy preferences per se, or asking people what they want from a policy perspective. That really gets into the weeds, and people may have opinions, but it's hard for them to judge, which of the options will make a difference. That's a question for Kevin, and not necessarily a question for Joe or Jane on the street to really judge accurately. But they can and should have a say in the housing they want to live in and what they need. And that's kind of what I would argue is look at the data in terms of what people are looking for. Because as Kevin points out, you know, the data in terms of what's actually being built suggests that they're not looking for single family detached homes, because those are not the units that are being built or being sold.
Yeah. And Kevin, same question to you. What advice would you give to municipal officials about how to respond to the data that you've presented?
I think there's a couple things. One is that there's no question that some of the choices around single detached housing right now are affordability choices. I mean, anybody who's realistic, when I was looking at some data out of Perth County the other day, and in order to afford virtually any house that's for sale in Perth County and meet affordability guidelines, your household income has to be well over $200,000. And so, you know, the fact that people are choosing other types of units are not just a reflection of their choice, it's a reflection of their realities. And we're in a position right now where the reality is that housing is so expensive that and we're not going to drag down the prices dramatically. So we're going to have to provide other options, and the other options come in different forms. And I think as people look at it, counselors look at this, they have to understand it's not just meeting the kind of desires of I want my community to look exactly the same as it always has. The needs in the future mean the communities have to change. And the question becomes, how do we start to introduce that change in a positive way? And that's communication, absolutely. Gentle density. There is so much capacity there, and we're seeing it delivered in, especially in Kitchener and Waterloo. And Guelph is doing an amazing job. 22% of theirs is ADUs, and that, you know, it doesn't negatively impact the community at all. So you've got to start looking at things differently. The challenges we face in affordability, climate change, all of them, you know, as they pile up, you know, we have to do things differently. The other thing to recognize is as single detached units, the construction of them decline. I'll be the first to say it does not necessarily mean that the desire for singles is plummeting. It's not. Young families want a place to live, but we've got to remember that you know, the source of single detached dwellings, there's two of them. There's new construction and there's recycling the old units. And when we look at the region of Waterloo, I looked at 2016 data, which is the only thing I had available at the time, and there was 99,000 of those units of 113 at the time. 99,000 were owned by people who were going to be over 70 years of age in 2051. Like, it's a massive number. And the potential of maybe 80,000, 70, 80,000 of those recycling is real. And to give you some context, we only built 19,000 singles and semis in the region of Waterloo since 2006. So the recycling is going to accommodate a huge amount of the demand. So those are, you know, kind of the advice I can give is things are changing and you've got to change with them, and you've really got to prepare for the future, because it's now. It's not months from now or years from now. It's now.
Okay. One more quick question. Imagine you had the Premier and the Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing for a minute and a half. What advice would you give them, given the data that you've presented today? And Sarah, I'll start with you.
Also a good question. but a little harder to answer if you kind of recognize the kind of shorter term nature of and politics and the need to demonstrate kind of progress on this file for the provincial government, because the way I read the data, and consistent with Kevin's saying, is that there's generational change at play here that is longer term and creates opportunities for things to happen differently than they have in the past, but it requires a longer term perspective. So I think the only thing that I would say is take a look at kind of the generations, make sure we understand from their perspective what they're looking for. And if the goal is to kind of provide for the Ontario population, that's an important part of the puzzle. And you won't get to your goal of meeting the needs of the Ontario population without taking that into account.
Kevin, question to you. You have the Premier and the Minister of Housing for a minute and a half. What do you say to them based on the data that you've presented this evening?
Well, three quick comments. The first is you've got to start participating in non-market housing. There is no solution to any of this without the governments getting back into a role of whether they're building it and managing it, I don't know, but they have got to get into it at the federal level and at the provincial level in a huge way. This is not a little one, that's a big one. The second one is we've got to build for seniors. There's an upside to recycling the single detached homes, but even forgetting that, we have so many seniors that are going to be in need of alternative forms of housing. Yes, we can age in place. Yes, we can support age in place, but there are going to be many seniors that even that isn't good enough for, and particularly in the rural communities. I'm taking this on as this is a crusade. They are walking off a cliff as we speak when it comes to providing for their residents as they age. They are going to end up having to move into Waterloo or Kitchener or Owen Sound, or even there's probably problems. The third thing, and Franz, you've heard me say this so many times, so is the Premier, stop changing the freaking rules. We have had so many rule changes that planners and municipal staff are just running in circles trying to figure out what the rules are now and doing studies and hiring consultants that we don't need to solve these problems. Let's stop it. If municipalities had a consistent set of rules, they may not be perfect, but let us work with them and get at least something done. Because right now, we are wasting so much time on administration when there is such a critical problem that we're facing. And the other one, I have to say, don't kill the regions. So stupid. It is just so short-sighted. I have no idea what the purpose of that is. You will not build a single extra house by doing that.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank again to Sarah and Kevin for your excellent presentations and questions. And now to your questions. There are a whole bunch here. We were planning to end at 8, but we may run a bit later, and I think Kevin and Sarah have agreed to stay on a bit longer. So we're going to try to get through your questions. If we do not get to your questions or we don't properly deal with your question, please just email me at info@livableontario.ca, and I'll forward them to Sarah and Kevin for an answer. So I'm just going to go through a small number of quick ones. Will the recording of the webinar be available later? Yes. Sandy writes, or does your organization have a stance on increased density through reform zoning bylaws? Alliance for Livable Ontario is going to be coming up with a housing report shortly. It'll answer there. Graham asks, we are challenged to get a nonprofit seniors housing project constructed in our community outside the GTA. Biggest stumbling block we found is the Ontario government, all talk, no money. CMHC and the county and the city have been supportive. Erwin, here's an actual question from Erwin. Was the Environics survey restricted to the named cities? Was Ottawa excluded?
Yes, Ottawa was excluded. We had an opportunity to ask a set of questions on a GTA, on an existing survey for GTA, so we took advantage of it. Our goal is to repeat this and build it out actually for other municipalities in Ontario. So, yeah, that would include, for example, Hamilton, Ottawa in the future, if we can do so.
And related to that, Marge asked, rural and semi-urban areas would likely produce very different results from many things that, where many things are not walkable, incomes are generally lower, employment is different, transit is different, etc. Do you plan to look at these areas? It is important work.
Yeah, definitely, for sure. And I think the GTA numbers themselves, like even though, yes, it's focused on GTA, showed those starting differences between 416 and 905. Like, obviously that's not rural by any stretch, but it starts to pull things apart, or by income, it starts to pull things apart. So yeah, definitely important. I think that's part of the complexity of asking about housing preferences. And Kevin showed that huge list of determinants of what goes into people making housing choices. So part of it is trying to figure out what are the main drivers of this. Also reflecting on the opposite side, what's actually available in terms of supply. So it's a complicated topic. And so I think there's a lot more opportunity to build on and understand better what's going on.
Okay. Anonymous writes, the GTA is such a huge, complicated settlement area. Can any of the survey results translate to forecasts or predictors for smaller urban areas north or outside of the GTA?
Same question.
Yeah.
I'd like to do survey research in those regions to kind of check that.
Right.
I would guess that there would be some similarity, but it would be a guess at this point.
Yeah. It replaces to grow. So the planners got it badly wrong, but the developers built what the people want. I guess that's over to you, Kevin. Is that a proper interpretation of the data?
I think there's no question the land economists got it wrong. They got the form of housing terribly wrong. And that has huge implications on things like collection of development charges. If somebody builds an apartment instead of a single detached unit, the municipality is short tens of thousands of dollars for each of those units. So land economists certainly got the forecasting wrong. I've got to say, though, I think the planners and the form of development that Places to Grow has pushed us to has been incredibly important in preparing us for what's coming. The intensification targets were absolutely critical. People thought we were nuts when we put the intensification targets in place, and they have been so critical in preparing municipalities to deliver on the kind of housing that we need, and especially transit supportive. We would, without Places to Grow and the policies in there, we'd be in the backwoods at the moment when it comes to being prepared for climate change and some of the other things. So legitimate, absolutely, planners need to take some responsibility for, being in, planning for the wrong type of housing when obviously the developers, I wouldn't say they got it right. I think what they've done is they've delivered fairly well on the type of housing that makes money. And unfortunately, what we need is a whole bunch of housing that doesn't make as much money, and the developers haven't delivered on that. And yeah, that's not a criticism of the private sector. They're not a charity. They have every right to make profit, but we need housing that unfortunately can't be delivered through that model, and governments have to get into it.
Two quick definitional questions. When Kevin talks about apartments, does he mean apartments, condos, all heights? Like, is apartments just a catch-all for anything which is more than, a single family house, or what does it mean?
Yeah, apartments for most of the data, and this isn't just me doing it, CMHC and others, they lump them together. And in
Right.
fact, ADUs, the accessory dwelling units, which are, add-ons to a house, laneway house, coach house, basement apartments, those types of things, they're considered apartments in most of the data, just so people are aware of that.
Right. Anonymous asks, as to senior housing in rural communities, do you mean retirement homes, apartments, condos, a mix?
Oh, definitely a mix. We need people. One of the things that's happened that's changed the housing market dramatically is people's retirements have grown dramatically in the last 20 years. My father had a life expectancy of 71, and I have a life expectancy somewhere in the mid 80s. He retired at 65. If I'd done what I should have done with my finances, I could have retired a little earlier than that. But the difference is massive, and so we need to be preparing for that. We need to understand that things are changing really quickly. And
Okay. A question for Sarah. What other communities would you be surveying next in regards to housing preferences?
Those who express interest. So please get in touch. I'm curious to hear from different municipalities about, is this something that would be of interest to them, of helpful to them? We would definitely consider that.
Okay. And
Franz,
question. Yep.
can I just I must admit I got lost in that last answer. I apologize. Certainly in the rural areas, there's no question that you need the full continuum. That's where I was going with this. You need a continuum of housing for retirees. It's not just the nursing home at one end and a single at the other. We need that continuum, and that is everything from multiple dwellings through to assisted living dwellings. I'm stressing the rural community because I've seen so many people who are going to have to move out of their community that they've lived in all their lives. And we are facing massive exodus potentially from our rural areas, and it doesn't have to be that way. We need to start preparing for that to deal with the members of our community. I apologize for
That's
butting in
fine.
again.
Sarah, question from Mark. Did you look specifically at family structure? This is likely changing over the demographic cohorts and could be a key factor in housing preferences. People with kids are going to want ground access space, becomes less important pre-kids or empty nesters.
100%. We didn't specifically ask about family structure, so I don't have that data, but it's pretty clear in the generational data when you see it's the boomers and the Gen Z who are most open to non-single family homes in a walkable space. For millennials and the Gen Xers, they're like split down the middle. So for some of them, not all of them, but for some of them, it's very important that they have that single family home for their families in the kind of their time of their life. And so, yeah, I understand that that's clearly a factor as well, and something we would kind of try to build into future surveys.
Just to let people know, we're now at 8 o'clock. I think we probably have about another 5 minutes of questions. So if you can stay on, please do. A question for Kevin. Does the large increase in apartments capture what are actually condos, not rental apartments?
Yeah.
How does this skew the findings given the very high portion of condos in the GTA that are owned by, quote, investors, not residents, given the scale of the investor condo boom fueled by an extended period of very low interest rates?
Yeah, there's no question that the investor-owned condos have skewed the data and have created a market that in other countries is actually causing significant problems because developers are building basically to sell to investors. In Canada, I think what has happened in part is that the investor participation in the marketplace has really driven up the prices. And, that is, it may have fueled, it not only has it fueled more construction of certain types of units than we otherwise may have needed, but it's driven up the cost of those units because, my kids are competing against people with significant equity who can afford to pay more. And then the typical investor, if they've overpaid for the house, is also jacking up the rental costs associated with it. So the investor participation is it's not, it's positive for the boomer and other investors who, the interest rates were so low that they weren't making great money in their retirement savings, but it hasn't been good for the housing market. And somebody well above my pay grade needs to really get a handle on that, because I think trying to figure out how to deal with the investor participation and the monetization of housing is part of the solution. And like I say, somebody smarter than me is going to have to do that.
Yeah. Okay, more questions are
you
coming
didn't
in.
have to agree that quickly.
We've got more questions coming in that I think we have time for. So my apologies for those of you whose questions I will miss. As I said before, please email me at info@livableontario.ca, and I will pass those on to Kevin and Sarah, depending on who it's for. We have another question. Don't we need to encourage multi-generational buildings as seen in Scandinavia and in particular Finland? We can't possibly provide exactly what every generation perceives it currently needs. Don't we need to present new models which have proved successful elsewhere?
Absolutely. There's no question. We are at a point in time where, like, any good ideas, bring them to the table. And we need developers that are willing to take risks on the types of units that maybe they haven't built before. And we need to get out there with communication and education type programs to start to gather examples of these types of things and bring them to the councilors, bring them to the developers, and start to educate people about what's possible, because there is so much out there that is better than we do here in Ontario. And we've got to start adopting that. Absolutely.
Another question in Sarah's presentation, the survey question was if people would prefer to live in a quote walkable or live in a walkable community. For a community to be walkable, in my eyes, that means the relevant amenities are built right into neighborhoods, groceries, schools, hairdressers, banks, etc. There are zoning and other bylaws in many municipalities that prohibit this kind of development. For example, residential instead of mixed-use zoning. How does mixed-use zoning or other bylaws fit into this discussion? I suspect that's a Kevin question.
There's no question at all that we've got to work. So much of it is planning ahead, and especially when you're dealing with major transit station areas, we've got to make sure that we've got the right destinations in the right locations. We've got to make sure that we're getting housing in these areas at a scale that makes sense. Not, 100-story buildings may be good in some locations somewhere, but not everywhere. And same with 50s and same with 40s. And quite frankly, I'd be the happiest person around if people started to deliver an awful lot more 6 to 9 stories, which you can get an awful lot of housing that way and build in some of these uses into the ground floors. Start to create community, start to create the types of uses in clusters that allow for the 15-minute community. That I know that one's is taking on a bad name in some areas, but it's the 15-minute walkability as a standard is an achievable goal, and it's one that we should be aspiring to.
One final question, and I think this is to both of you. Robert writes, Ontario has a $28 billion plan to build roads and highways that does not take these statistics into account. That is a major error. How can you present this data to Ontario to show them that they are going in the wrong direction? And do you plan to do this?
We've been doing it now for years, and unfortunately, I'm not sure that anybody's really listening on the other end, and I hate to say it that way, but we're off pursuing things that, quite frankly, anybody who's looking ahead and looking at climate change and looking at the challenges we're facing, my goodness, there is so much better places to spend that money than building new highways. And the data, I think, unfortunately, to some extent, the whole push on single detached dwellings, that it comes from the developers, and it justifies more land, which justifies their speculation and the uplift in value once it's brought into the urban areas. And it's hard to overcome that kind of lobbying with the government, but we're trying. And anybody who can join in, you're welcome to, for sure. Franz, can I just give one little pitch here, which I think on the ADUs, and there's a group out there that's doing work on that, and that's the rehousing group. That it's a good rehousing.ca would be a good thing for people to look at. There's some good ideas there, and I saw somebody asked about ADUs and how do we do it. Well, they're working on projects that will help councils, will help the public to in fact do this, and promoting a good thing is never a bad thing. So.
And Sarah, final thoughts to you. Anything that springs to mind about changing the province's mind about $28 billion budgets on roads and highways?
We're willing to give it a good college try. I mean, sure, let's try to get the data in front of them. I think there's also a piece of information from another survey that Environics has done about Gen Z and driving. So, we asked our question about single family detached homes because we were trying to test that kind of accepted narrative, right? But the other side of that aspect of is, do you want to live in a place where you don't have to drive? Gen Z of the generations are the least likely to say that they think that they're going to buy a car at some point in their lives. And right now they're least likely or less likely than other generations to even have a driver's license. Obviously, some of that is age. But if you even look at the adults, the 18 plus Gen Z, many of them and many more than in other generations don't have a driver's license. So looking ahead again and planning ahead, if these generations don't value driving, then why are we investing that much money in roads? And I mean, there's also the climate perspective and the energy use perspective. Does this make the most sense in terms of how we use our dollars, our tax dollars? Yeah.
Well, thank you, audience, for your great questions. Thank you so much to Sarah and Kevin for your great presentations and great answers. Before we sign off, two more quick things. If you like this webinar, please check out the other webinars and resources that we've created. They are all at the livableontario.ca. And also, to help us do more of these sort of webinars, please make a donation now. Just follow the link that I've just put in the chat, and this will take you to the website of the Small Change Fund. They're a charitable partner, and you can make a donation there and get a charitable tax receipt. And doing that will ensure we can continue efforts like this evening to build a livable Ontario. Finally, as I said at the outset, we have recorded this webinar, the presentation decks, and the recording will be available on our website in the coming days. Please share this link with others, especially if you're municipal officials or no municipal officials. I think this is important, information for them to know. And don't forget to sign up and become a member of the Alliance for Livable Ontario if you like what you're doing. Thank you so much, and I wish you all a good evening. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.